Last week, I visited a friend at his new office in the city's financial district. It was one of those, prestige buildings, a towering shard of blue glass that looks exactly like every other skyscraper in London, Dubai, or New York.
I think I know the type.
Exactly. And inside, he was just beaming, showing off the efficiency of the space. He pointed out the open plan layout, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the endless brushed steel and polished concrete. He kept using words like clean, transparent, and optimized.
The corporate buzzwords.
Right. But then the conversation drifted into his recent vacation.
Yeah.
And the shift in his demeanor was, well, it's jarring. He'd just come back from a week in an old, somewhat chaotic neighborhood in Prague. His face just softened.
Ah.
And he started describing the cobblestones, the narrow winding streets that didn't make any grid-like sense, and the crumbling stone facades. He leaned in and said, I don't know what it is, but I just felt human there. I could actually breathe.
That's powerful.
It was such a fascinating contradiction. Here he was, sitting in the pinnacle of modern architectural success, a climate-controlled, perfectly lit, high-tech box. And yet, he spoke about it with this cold appreciation one might have for a sterilized surgical tool.
Right, functional but lifeless.
But when he spoke of the inefficient old world, he spoke of connection and home. He didn't even realize the irony. He was paying a premium to work in a machine that was actively starving his spirit, forcing him to flee halfway across the world just to feel grounded again. And it just raised this really disturbing question for me. If we are so advanced, why have we built a world that we're so desperate to escape?
That anecdote, it captures the entire thesis of this deep dive perfectly. What you observed, that tension between the sterile efficiency versus the vital chaos, that is the core crisis of the built environment today.
The machine versus the spirit.
It's exactly that. It's the friction between the optimized machine our modern cities have become and the complex biological and social needs of the human spirit.
That's it. So our mission today is really to investigate the foundational systemic reasons for this modern urban alienation. We're going to unpack the sociological diagnosis of city life that was established over a century ago.
Way back before the buildings were even conceived.
Exactly. Then we'll examine the high modernist architectural experiment that deliberately codified this alienation, looking at figures like Le Corbusier, and then pivot to the cutting-edge scientific and planning solutions like, say, biophilic design and new urbanism that are proving our innate need for nature and community.
This is about finding a shortcut, really, to understanding why the places we build so often make us miserable. And to do that, to understand what went wrong, we can't start with the buildings. We have to start with the people inside them.
Before the architects drew a single blueprint.
Precisely. Before that, sociologists were already observing and documenting the fundamental mental cost of life in the burgeoning metropolis.
So we need to start by drilling down on the turn of the 20th century. We're introducing the German sociologist and philosopher Georg Simmel. This is really where urban studies begins, isn't it?
Absolutely. Simmel's 1903 essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, is foundational. You have to picture the time this was written, a period of just cataclysmic change.
The Industrial Revolution is in full swing.
Millions of people are migrating from these established rural hierarchies, these tight-knit villages, into dense, rapidly industrializing urban centers all across Europe. And Simmel recognized that it was more than just a demographic change. It was an evolutionary change in the human psyche.
He saw right away that the overwhelming structures of the metropolis weren't just changing where people lived, but were fundamentally reshaping their mental life. How does he argue the city achieves this psychological transformation?
His focus was on what he termed formal sociology. And this is an important distinction because he wasn't really interested in the content of what people were doing, like, what factory they worked in, but the recurring forms of their interaction.
So not the what, but the how.
Exactly. How they navigated proximity and distance, speed and density. And for Simmel, the city's biggest impact is sensory overload. Just think of a constant, unrelenting barrage of stimuli. Countless fleeting faces, loud noises, flashing signs, the perpetual motion of traffic. It's an assault on the senses.
That constant directed attention, it must be exhausting.
It is mentally depleting. Simmel recognized that this sheer quantity and intensity of stimuli creates a psychological necessity for self-protection. Your mind has to build a shield, a filter, simply to function and preserve its limited cognitive resources.
Which brings us to his most famous concept, the Blasé attitude. We often think of this as just, urban apathy or people being rude.
Yeah.
But Simmel saw it as something much, much deeper. Right.
Absolutely. The blasé attitude is often misunderstood as a kind of moral failure, but Simmel defines it as a profound, cultivated indifference or emotional detachment. It's a strategic numbness.
The strategy.
Yes, explicitly a social survival strategy. You literally cannot afford to emotionally register every single person, every single misfortune, or every single stimulus you encounter on a crowded city street. If you did, you would suffer immediate mental collapse. You'd be overwhelmed.
So the emotional detachment isn't a personality flaw. It's a form of resource management. It's the mechanism by which you preserve your own autonomy and your capacity to function in this overwhelming environment. This is exactly what we see later in Erving Goffman's concept of civil inattention, isn't it?
It's the behavioral manifestation of the blasé attitude. It's the perfect way to put it. Civil inattention is that subtle, ritualized ignoring we perform, avoiding eye contact on a crowded train or sidewalk. We maintain physical proximity while performing social distance.
You're signaling something.
You're signaling, I acknowledge your presence, but I will not intrude upon your world, and I expect the same from you. And this mechanism is necessary because urbanization fundamentally changes the form of social life itself.
In a village or a rural community, your relationships are all based on shared history, emotional closeness, familiarity. You know everyone and their parents and their grandparents.
And that intimacy is completely replaced in the city by impersonality and transience. Spatial closeness, living in the same massive apartment block, does not translate into emotional or social closeness at all. Simmel saw that in the city, the social ties just fragment, often leaving the individual feeling completely rootless.
If the city forces us into these fleeting sort of transactional relationships, what does Simmel identify as the resulting psychological state regarding the people around us?
Well, this leads directly to his enduring theory of the stranger. The stranger is that figure who is physically present in the community but remains socially distant. They are, in his words, near and far at the same time.
I see.
In the massive complexity of metropolitan life, we simply don't have the mental bandwidth to process every person we encounter as a unique three-dimensional individual with a complex backstory. It's impossible.
So we default to categorization. We de-individualize them. We put them into boxes, into roles.
Precisely. We process them by type: the poor, the delivery driver, the businessman, the trader. It's a cognitive coping mechanism, a shortcut. We interact with a role or a category rather than the full, complex person. This process is necessary to navigate the complexity, but it is the key ingredient that contributes to that pervasive sense of anonymity and emotional isolation.
It sounds like a psychological trap then. To survive the city, you have to adopt this protective layer of indifference. But that very indifference is what isolates you.
It paints a stark picture, yes, but, and this is crucial, Simmel did not see the transition as entirely negative. This is the great paradox of urban rationality. While the metropolis isolates and creates emotional detachment, the environment simultaneously forces individuals to develop extraordinary rationality, self-restraint, and intellectual development.
How is the city an engine for intellectual sophistication?
Yeah.
That seems counterintuitive.
It's driven primarily by the economic structure, what he called the money economy. City life revolves around constant, instantaneous, often impersonal financial transactions. Dealing with money, prices, complex markets, it all demands a calculating, rational mindset.
You have to be sharp.
You have to be self-reliant, quick-witted, and intellectually sophisticated to thrive. The city demands precision, punctuality, and intellect over, say, emotional connection. It values the head over the heart.
So the trade-off is intellectual freedom and sophistication, but it's purchased at the cost of emotional closeness and social warmth. Simmel has set the stage perfectly by diagnosing this internal need for self-protection against sensory overload. The individual is already psychologically stressed.
And this is the perfect pivot, because right after Simmel's diagnosis of this psychological chaos, the architects decided to intervene. They decided to solve the chaos with physical engineered order.
And now we are moving directly into the era of high modernism and the ideology that completely dominated 20th century urban planning, leading to the construction of that optimized, sterile world my friend was so desperate to escape.
And the chief ideologue here is certainly Le Corbusier, with his famous defining declaration that a house should be a machine for living in. This is a catastrophic conceptual shift. It moves architecture away from organic connection, from symbolic ornamentation, towards sterile, purely functionalist engineering.
It sounds less like architecture and more like manufacturing.
That was precisely the goal. Le Corbusier was openly hostile to the traditional organically grown city, the one with the narrow, winding streets like your friend found in Prague. He saw it as hopelessly chaotic, filthy, inefficient, and morally corrupt.
A problem to be solved.
An engineering problem. He believed the city could and should be treated like an industrial product, designed for total rationalization and maximum efficiency, much like a mass-produced automobile.
And this meant standardizing everything, correct? Ignoring local climate, local culture, or historical building materials for elements that were just universally applicable. A window in Brazil should be the same as a window in France.
Yes. The drive was for universal utility, ignoring what we call the vernacular dimension. But the real urban planning crime, the one that codified alienation, was his core principle, functional segregation.
Ah, yes.
This doctrine was enshrined in the 1933 Athens Charter, which rigidly separated the four primary functions of the city: residence, work, recreation, and traffic.
So instead of a lively neighborhood where you might live above a shop and walk across the street to work, you have these massive dedicated zones: the residential zone, the business park zone, the park zone, and the highway zone. This deliberately kills mixed-use street life.
It was a direct attempt to impose a simplistic visual order, what he described as an organized, serene, forceful, airy, ordered entity. They truly believed that if the spatial arrangement was purely rational, efficient, and geometrically clear, then the complex social and psychological problems that Simmel identified would just disappear.
They traded complexity for legibility.
A terrible trade. And the perfect and most catastrophic example of this ideology taken to its purest form is, of course, Brasília.
The ultimate modernist city.
It stands as the ultimate high modernist monument. Designed by Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer in the 1950s, it was a city designed from a theoretical zero point, with zero reference to existing traditions, topography, or human habits, just pure theory.
And the scale of the city is crucial here. It was literally designed to be appreciated from the altitude of an airplane, not from the perspective of a pedestrian on the ground, which tells you everything you need to know about the prioritization, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The plan was gargantuan. It was structured around massive, segregated zones connected by vast highways designed for speed, and they introduced the superquadra system, these massive, isolated apartment blocks, self-contained units intended to house thousands of residents, surrounded by large expanses of what was supposed to be parkland.
Describe the failure of the superquadra. It wasn't just a building, it was a spatial manifestation of that functional segregation you mentioned.
It was an exercise in isolation. Each superquadra was designed to be autonomous, providing housing, some minimal commerce, and some green space. But crucially, it was disconnected from everything else by these monumental roads and vast empty distances. The plan failed dramatically because it eliminated the density and the spontaneous complexity necessary for social life.
Because if commerce, work, and entertainment are miles away in a different zone, you have absolutely no reason to be on the street unless you are, waiting for a bus.
Precisely. The roads became gigantic avenues dedicated to rapid vehicle movement, not for walking. This created these vast, empty public spaces, monumental plazas that were magnificent to look at from a distance, but profoundly isolating to be in. They discouraged casual encounters, loitering, or the establishment of small, informal businesses.
It effectively became a city without crowds, devoid of the vitality that comes from chance encounters. This absence of spontaneous social mixing is exactly what critics like Jane Jacobs pointed out as the core failing.
Jacobs, yes. She viewed the simplistic visual order of high modernism as a kind of aesthetic arrogance, an art of the facade, she called it, that completely disregarded the complex, messy, overlapping reality of human life. She famously argued that functional segregation was inherently destructive to the city's social health.
And she just flipped the core modernist tenet on its head. She argued that a vital city doesn't need separation. It needs the diversity of simultaneous uses, the very thing Le Corbusier sought to sterilize.
She was absolutely adamant that high density, short blocks, and mixed primary uses, people living, working, and recreating in the same area, are non-negotiable conditions for a healthy city. The activity has to happen all day long, ensuring continuous use and observation.
Which brings us to her enduring defense of the sidewalk. For Jacobs, the street wasn't just asphalt for cars. It was the essential primary site of public order and safety, regulated by what she termed casual surveillance.
This is the social software of a successful city. When residents, shop owners, business owners are constantly using and watching the street just by living their lives, it creates a self-regulating, visible social mechanism that promotes trust and safety. Functional segregation kills this entirely. If the work zone is empty at night, it becomes unsafe and anonymous.
And we see this played out perfectly in the post-war housing experiments that adopted these high modernist principles. I have a story that illustrates that tension between functional efficiency and the tragic loss of that casual social fabric.
Let's hear it.
We can try to imagine a neighborhood in the north of England through the eyes of a woman named Lara. I saw her interviewed in a documentary about post-war housing redevelopment. She grew up in what urban planners disdainfully called slums, these tightly packed pre-war row houses with poor sanitation.
Right, the very places the modernists wanted to demolish.
Exactly. But Alara remembers them differently. She recalled the essential stoop culture, where the street was a semi-private extension of the living room. If she needed a cup of sugar, she didn't call the neighbor, she just leaned out the window. If a child scraped a knee, 3 neighbors were there instantly.
The eyes on the street that Jacobs talked about.
Precisely. Then in the 1960s, the city demolished her community and relocated her to a brutalist high-rise estate, a machine for living, traced for its efficiency. On paper, it was perfect. Central heating, indoor plumbing, efficient vertical density. But Alara describes the concrete walkways connecting the apartments, the streets and the sky, as dead zones. The wind just swept through them and the doors were heavy, shutting residents inside their private boxes. The architecture, designed to solve problems of privacy and hygiene, inadvertently killed the casual surveillance in the stoop culture. She told the interviewer, "We have warm radiators now, but the people have gone cold. We live stacked on top of each other, yet I have never felt more alone."
That narrative, the ghost of the row house, is genuinely heartbreaking because it is the inherent tragedy of high modernism in action. The planners, motivated by this, noble drive for sanitary and structurally sound housing, they solved the hygiene problem while completely ignoring the social problem.
Or rather, they created a new, profound social isolation problem.
Exactly. They saw the traditional neighborhood as a problem of physical disorder and filth, when in reality, those tightly packed, small-scale houses fostered these tight-knit, spontaneous social networks. The high-rise estate was designed for vertical efficiency, but those isolated streets in the sky proved to be dangerous, anonymous, and windswept, systematically dismantling the informal trust and self-policing mechanisms that kept the old neighborhood cohesive.
It was just intellectual arrogance.
It was. The modernists ignored the social and psychological dimensions entirely, viewing the city as a simple engineering problem solvable with technology and geometric clarity. The resulting feeling of isolation, that constant need to flee to a place where you feel human again, is exactly what Simmel had predicted decades earlier. The machine was built to save us from chaos, but instead it starved our innate needs.
So we've covered the sociological diagnosis of urban alienation and the catastrophic architectural intervention that just made it worse. The modern city, full of sterile efficiency, is the result.
And now, the critical question. How do we fix a world designed to ignore our basic human needs? We pivot from sociology and failed ideology to applied science, specifically the science of our innate connection to the natural world. This is where biophilia provides the remedy.
Biophilia, a concept popularized by the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, is defined as the innate emotional affiliation and dependence of human beings on the natural world. And the hypothesis posits that this connection is not just learned, it's a deep genetic evolutionary trait necessary for our cognitive and emotional function.
It makes perfect sense evolutionarily. Humans co-evolved in nature. For 99% of human history, our cognitive structures were optimized for survival in natural landscapes. So it shouldn't be surprising at all that being surrounded by natural systems fosters greater tranquility, mental restoration, and creativity.
And we have decades of evidence for this now.
We have 40 years of strong scientific evidence supported by adaptive and utilitarian paradigms, emphasizing this powerful link between nature access and human health.
And this link is absolutely vital for urban residents who are statistically far more exposed to psychological stressors, leading to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and generalized stress compared to rural populations. Urban green spaces are not luxuries, they are preventative health infrastructure.
And the research has moved beyond simple correlation. It's now highly specific, focusing on the actual mechanisms. There are 2 major, well-established theoretical frameworks that explain how nature restores us.
Okay, let's start with attention restoration theory, or RT, developed by Stephen and Rachel Kaplan. We mentioned earlier how the city forces us into exhausting directed attention. How does RT address this?
Right. So directed attention is that demanding, focused effort required for tasks like driving in traffic, concentrating in a loud office, or navigating a dense crowd. The exact mental strain the Simmelian metropolis imposes. This causes mental fatigue. RD explains that time spent in nature allows the brain to engage in soft fascination.
Soft fascination being what exactly?
It's the effortless, involuntary attention elicited by natural elements, like watching water flow or clouds drift or leaves rustle in the wind. These stimuli are complex enough to keep our attention lightly engaged, but they're not so demanding that they cause cognitive fatigue. This is why nature restores attention and improves cognition, literally recharging the mind that's been depleted by urban demands.
That's a powerful distinction. The demanding focus of the city versus the restorative ease of nature.
Exactly. And the other major theory is psychophysiological stress reduction theory, or PSR, championed by Roger Ulrich. PSR focuses specifically on the emotional and physical dimensions of this.
So how does looking at a tree actually lower my stress hormone levels?
Ulrich's work was groundbreaking. He showed that exposure to natural scenes, even just looking at images of nature, can rapidly reduce physiological indicators of stress. We're talking lowered heart rate, muscle tension, and cortisol levels.
That quickly.
Very quickly. Nature supports rapid stress recovery and promotes positive emotional affect because, evolutionarily, landscapes that supported life green spaces, water, safe vantage points signaled safety and resource availability. Our nervous system perceives these environments as inherently non-threatening. Both RT and PSR confirm that exposure to these natural environments, what are often called green-blue spaces, provides measurable, significant benefits for mental health and well-being.
So, if high modernism designed a sterile, efficient environment that starved our spirit and caused chronic mental fatigue, then biophilic design is the applied science that seeks to integrate life back into the machine.
That's the perfect way to frame it. Biophilic design is about systematically aligning artificial spaces with our intrinsic human biological and psychological needs. And it is shown scientifically to reduce stress, stimulate creativity, and even accelerate healing in hospitals, schools, and offices. And with the ongoing trend of urbanization, these benefits are absolutely essential for large-scale public health.
And the practice of biophilic design isn't just, throwing a few potted plants into a lobby. It involves highly specific strategies.
Oh, absolutely. It operates along several distinct dimensions, which have been identified by researchers like Kellert and Calabrese. The first is the organic dimension, which refers to integrating natural forms, patterns, and materials, either directly, like a living wall, or indirectly with artwork of nature, or even symbolically by using natural wood or stone textures.
And the second dimension is more about context and identity, right?
Yeah. Yes, the place-based or vernacular dimension. This is architecture tied fundamentally to the local culture, the local ecology, and geography. This is a direct philosophical rejection of that global style Le Corbusier advocated, where buildings look the same everywhere. Biophilic design demands that a building in the desert should look and function differently from one on the coast.
We have a perfect illustration of this therapeutic effect of nature integration in the workplace. The specific antidote to that steel and glass box you described in your opening. I recently came across a deep dive into neuroarchitecture that referenced the experience of a software engineer living in Tokyo. Let's call him Kenji. For years, Kenji worked in the heart of the Shinjuku district, a massive shrine to modernist efficiency. Just endless walls of steel, glass, and concrete.
The ultimate machine.
He described his daily life as existing within a grayscale. He would wake up in a beige apartment, take a steel train, and sit in a glass box for 10 hours. He wrote about a specific kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, a low-level ambient anxiety that just buzzed like a faulty fluorescent light.
It wasn't physical exhaustion.
No, he wasn't tired from his complex coding work. He was tired from the sensory deprivation of his environment. Then, his company moved to a new pilot office designed with biophilic principles. And this wasn't just decorative. The building featured a green facade that filtered sunlight through living vines, and the air circulation system was designed to mimic natural breezes rather than conditioned blasts.
So, multi-sensory approach.
Yes, and Kenji mentioned a specific moment, stepping out onto a small terrace garden on the 20th floor during a lunch break. For the first time in years, he heard the rustle of leaves over the hum of traffic. He wrote, "It felt like my brain finally exhaled."
Wow.
That immediate connection to a living ecosystem amidst the concrete instantly lowered his cortisol levels, transforming a sterile workspace into a place where he felt psychologically stable again.
Kenji's experience is so valuable because it underscores the rapid physical effect of biophilic design. The exhaustion he felt from the grayscale was sensory deprivation that triggered a constant low-level stress response. The intervention, the green facade and natural air, is fundamentally about psychological and cognitive maintenance. It illustrates that environments can either elevate stress or actively lower it, which is something high modernism entirely ignored.
And this research is getting increasingly detailed, isn't it? Moving directly into the realm of neuroarchitecture, which shows that even the shapes we use matter.
Absolutely. We now know the visual attractiveness of urban form profoundly influences user experience and mental well-being. And the most fascinating application of this is the incorporation of concepts like fractal geometry and biomorphic shapes and patterns in architecture.
That sounds incredibly technical. How does a mathematical pattern influence my well-being?
Think of a tree branch dividing, or a coastline, or the intricate patterns on a fern. These are all examples of fractal geometry complex, repeating patterns that look similar whether you zoom in or zoom out. Our visual system evolved over millennia to process these patterns effortlessly.
So, unlike looking at the stripped-down, visually predictable grid of a modernist facade, which offers no visual complexity and quickly exhausts the eye,
natural complexity based on fractals is non-tiring to the brain. In fact, studies show that viewing natural fractals reduces stress and mental fatigue, reducing cortisol levels within minutes. This is a scientific validation that the ornate, complex architecture that the modernists rejected as clutter is actually cognitively superior for our brains than their stripped-down clean lines. We are biologically wired to find complex organic patterns restful.
So the solution is twofold. Inject nature back into the city and fundamentally redesign the urban form itself to align with our evolutionary wiring and reject those visually exhausting sterile forms.
This is the driving force behind what's now called biophilic urbanism. It is a holistic approach, distinguished by its emphasis on deep sensory interactions, education, culture, and nature-based civic activities. It's not just greenwashing, adding a roof garden for optics. It's a comprehensive, systemic approach to solve urban challenges like pollution, alienation, and traffic congestion.
So how do city planners move from Kenji's successful office design to transforming an entire metropolis? We need to talk about the structural levers for this kind of change.
A recent structural analysis study provided a comprehensive framework for achieving a truly biophilic city. It identified 54 specific components across 5 critical dimensions: institutional, natural, economic, social, and health. This helps us understand what actions are actually the most impactful.
Okay, let's break down that framework using an analogy, because otherwise it just sounds like an unmanageable list of academic components.
Let's think of the structural analysis, like a car engine designed for sustainability. The analysis categorized factors based on their influence, how much they change the system, and their dependency, how much they are affected by the system.
Okay, so what are the driving forces? The ignition and the fuel.
Exactly. These are the components with high influence and low dependency. They are the systemic levers city managers can pull to initiate change. And these drivers are primarily institutional. The existence of laws regarding biophilic design adoption, specific biophilic programs, consistent funding availability for green infrastructure, and the integration of biomimicry principles into design codes.
So a concrete example of a driving force would be a city council issuing municipal bonds specifically earmarked for converting gray infrastructure, like unused parking lots, into public green spaces. That policy input drastically shifts the whole system.
Precisely. And conversely, the analysis identified the system outcomes, the components with the highest dependency and lowest influence. These are the things we hope to achieve, like the promotion of physical and mental health, overall human-nature compatibility, and improved functionality and well-being. These are the result, the speed and the distance you travel in the car.
So the key to success lies in the connectors. What were the most strategic factors identified? The key bidirectional components.
These are the steering wheel and the tires, the linking components that possess both strong influence and high dependency. They are strategic because they rapidly absorb and transmit changes throughout the entire system. And the most crucial bidirectional factors include strengthening the human-nature relationship, reinforcing a broad spectrum of natural values, and fostering participation.
So strengthening the human-nature relationship isn't just a desirable outcome, it's also a strategic driver of further policy change. Why is that?
Because it acts as both an output and an input. When citizens feel a strong connection to their local ecology, which is an output of good design, they are much more likely to politically support, advocate for, and vote for the policies and funding the drivers that maintain and expand that green infrastructure. It creates a self-reinforcing, positive feedback loop that steers the entire system toward sustainability.
This focus on strengthening participation in relationships brings us right back to the social dimension, the absolute failure of high modernism to foster community. And a massive part of this social failure stems from the dominance of the vehicle.
Absolutely. Modern planning prioritized traffic throughput over human interaction. Cities were literally torn up to install vast high-speed avenues, which ironically increased traffic congestion and physically separated people from each other and from the places they needed to go. We need a fundamental return to the human scale.
This is the core mandate of new urbanism, which seeks to reverse that functional segregation and car dependency that created these isolated living spaces.
Right.
We saw this need play out dramatically in the story of Mark. I was reading a case study on new urbanism centered on a man named Mark, who had spent decades living in a sprawling, low-density suburb in Florida. For most of his adult life, Mark's existence was entirely defined by the automobile. His house was an island, isolated by vast green lawns in these winding cul-de-sacs. To get a gallon of milk, to see a friend, or to go to work, he had to get in his car.
A familiar story for millions.
He posted on a forum about the pervasive isolation of his weekends, describing his neighborhood as a beautiful prison where he rarely saw a human face that wasn't behind a windshield. Mark eventually relocated to a traditional neighborhood designed on new urbanist principles, a kind of 50-minute city concept.
Change.
The difference he described was dramatic. The streets were narrow to intentionally slow down cars, the houses had front porches placed close to the sidewalk, and there was a mixed-use town square within walking distance. And he shared this simple anecdote, walking to a coffee shop on a Saturday morning. He didn't plan to meet anyone, but he bumped into a neighbor and the local baker. They just stood and talked for 20 minutes.
The unplanned encounter.
That casual, unplanned interaction, the creation of the third place, had been engineered out of his previous life. He realized that the architecture itself was inviting him to participate in society rather than hide from it.
That story, The Return to the Village, is a powerful illustration of social engineering through design. Functionalist planning and suburban sprawl created isolated spaces where socializing requires active, planned effort. You have to call ahead, you have to drive there, you have to schedule the interaction.
And new urbanism uses design principles, walkable density, narrow streets, mixed-use zoning, to achieve the exact opposite, to foster spontaneous, casual interaction.
The front porch becomes a crucial architectural element here, doesn't it? It acts as a transitional space between the private home and the public sidewalk, providing opportunities for casual surveillance and just a neighborly greeting. By integrating that mixed-use town square, Mark's new town successfully cultivated what the sociologist Ray Oldenburg called the third place.
The space that's not home and not work.
Exactly. The vital, informal, casual meeting grounds that knit a community together, distinct from home, the first place, and work, the second place.
It just reinforces the idea that architecture is not neutral. It either fosters connection and vitality or it starves it. The difference between Mark's suburb and his new town, or Ilara's stoop culture versus the anonymous superquadra, is the difference between a place that invites participation and a place that mandates isolation.
And this also provides a deeper analysis of that sense of rootlessness your friend felt in his sterile office tower. The functionalist city, with its globally recognizable interchangeable structures, corporate lobbies, chain malls, freeway interchanges, created what the anthropologist Mark Auger termed non-places.
Non-places. Spaces we pass through but which lack any real identity, history, or social meaning.
Exactly. They are spaces of transit and consumption. They are designed for function and efficiency, get me from point A to point B, or sell me product C, but they starve the human need for genre. Place a space imbued with identity, history, and meaningful human connection. We feel rootlessness in these non-places because they're devoid of the vernacular and historical texture that affirms our cultural existence.
This brings us completely full circle. The modern built environment, driven by this abstract, high modernist efficiency, fundamentally misunderstands the complex social and biological organism it is designed to serve.
The friction you described at the very beginning, that intense desire to flee the optimized city for the chaotic beauty of Prague, is the inevitable spiritual clash between the machine we are forced to inhabit and the natural, community-oriented world we are evolved for. We have to reject the notion that urban success is or the square footage of optimized office space.
The ultimate goal of design, therefore, cannot merely be efficiency or structural integrity. It has to be profound human flourishing and well-being. The conservative philosopher Roger Scruton argued compellingly that beauty is not a luxury, but a fundamental human necessity.
Beauty is an affirmation of human life and an invitation to belong. When we experience a building or a street that communicates history, care, human scale, and texture like the cobblestones and worn facades in Prague, it affirms that the place is a home, a part of a continuing narrative. It's not a sterilized tool. And we cannot build strong, emotionally cohesive communities in places that offer only cold appreciation for a functional instrument.
We have to reject the functionalist global style, those interchangeable glass boxes and concrete bunkers that look the same everywhere, and demand spaces that communicate history, care, and human connection. Building places we are eager to inhabit, not desperate to escape. That is the true measure of a successful city. Not how fast the traffic moves, but how deeply and securely its inhabitants feel they belong.